Hi there, esteemed audience, and welcome to another episode of Middle Grade Ninja. I'm your host, Rob Kent. As you know, I'm the author of Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees, the greatest book ever written. And it is available as a paperback, an audiobook, and the ebook is free. Free to download whenever you're watching or listening to this, wherever fine ebooks are sold. You can get your copy of Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees. Once you've enjoyed that, come see me with money for the sequel, Banneker Bones and the Alligator People. And get ready because June 14th, Banneker Bones and the Cyborg Conspiracy will be available, and that'll round out the trilogy. Under the super secret pen name Robert Kent, I've written some novels for older readers, such as my young adult novel, All Together Now, A Zombie Story, which I've been thinking about quite a lot recently. Because it's about an apocalypse set in Indiana, and I live in Indiana, and so I may indeed get to see just how close my imagined apocalypse matches up to the real thing. I've also got the Book of David, which is a 5-volume serial horror novel about an atheist who purchases a haunted house that then begins to give him religious visions involving flying saucers. It is nuts. If you're curious, you can dip your toe in. You can download the Book of David, Chapter 1 by Robert Kent for free as an ebook whenever you're watching or listening to this, wherever fine ebooks are sold. If you check the back catalog a few episodes, I also recorded my own audiobook for the first time ever, and that is available for free. You don't even have to read the Book of David Chapter 1. You can listen to me read it to you. And if you like that, come see me with money for chapters 2, 3, 4, and 5. As always, keep up with what's going on with the show, what's going on with me at middlegradeninja.com. Log in there. You can read hundreds of interviews with literary agents, authors, editors, publishing professionals, folks that would be of interest to you. And that's it for the announcements. Tonight, I couldn't be more thrilled. I am chatting with Ann Nesbit, and we're going to be discussing her new book, Daring Darleen, Queen of the Screen. Ann, how are you this evening?
I'm pretty good. All things considered. I mean, we have a beautiful spring happening here in California. I think maybe the nicest spread of poppies we've ever had. So it's okay. And we've got 5 people in the house, 3 of them home from college for quarantine and sheltering in place, and a dog. And so it's busy and lively and never dull.
That's excellent. We're getting started just a little bit late tonight because my 6-year-old is adjusting to his new routine of no school and stayed awake just a little bit later than usual, and we can't have him in the background. So now, hopefully, knock on wood, he is sleeping soundly, and we're going to be all right. So probably a good place to start is I try never to summarize other people's books or other people's biographies because I'm terrible at both. And why would you want to listen to me tell you about you when you're right there and could tell esteemed audience about yourself? So if you would give esteemed audience an overview of your background.
Well, I'm somebody who teaches. I'm in 2 different departments. I'm in the film and media department at Berkeley, and I'm also in the Slavic department, teaching Russian literature. So I have a kind of Russia hat, and I have a film studies, film history hat. And then I have a third hat, which is the one I guess I'm wearing right now, which is writing books for kids. So Daring Darleen, Queen of the Screen is my 6th book for the middle grade audience. And the first 3 were fantasies, like Cabinet of Verse and Box of Gargoyles and The Wrinkled Crown, and they came out with HarperCollins. And then I've done 3 historical novels with Candlewick, Cloud and Wallfish, which was a friendship and spying novel set in East Berlin in 1989. And then The Orphan Band of Springdale, which is set in 1941 in rural Maine, and is about family secrets and music. And then the new one, Daring Darleen, Queen of the Screen, which is set in 1914 in the Hollywood of its day, which was Fort Lee, New Jersey.
So you are a well-rounded person of many talents, it sounds like. You do a little bit of everything.
Many activities, anyway, right? I'm busy. It's true.
Was that always the plan, was to do a little bit of everything, or have you just kind of fallen into it as time has gone on?
I think it's more, you follow, there are certain strands that run through your life and you follow them. And sometimes you hang on to that thread and sometimes you're sort of forgetting and you're hanging on to another one. But I was always writing stories from childhood on. And I started being more serious about it, I guess, when I started teaching. And then eventually I had a couple strokes of good fortune, and I found an editor who was interested in my first book, and never stopped after that.
Well, the esteemed audience loves a good origin story, so let's start there. When did you write your first book, and how did you go about having this good story?
Okay, so the first book has quite a story to it. I was on sabbatical, and we were living in Paris, and I took the family. We all went, and we lived there for the year. And I threw the girls cruelly into the local public schools, and the twins' school was right across the street from a library and right kitty corner from this incredible building that had vines growing over it and heads of cows holding up the balcony and so on and so forth. Just amazing building from the early 20th century. And I looked at that and I thought, I'm pretty sure that that's the kind of place wizards and magicians would live. And so I wrote a book called The Cabinet of Earth. And this was the fourth novel I'd written. The first two were science fiction for grown-ups, or I thought for grown-ups. And the third one, which I was still also finishing at this time, was just for grown-ups. And the first two had never been picked up by anybody, although I'd had, nice comments and so on. But this time I was like, okay, I'm going to do this seriously, And so I joined the local chapter of the Society of Children's Book Writers and Illustrators, and they had a really wonderful Paris chapter, actually. And one day, the editor, Rosemary Brosnan from HarperCollins, she's a fantastic person and fantastic editor. She came to Paris to talk to our group. Only she was supposed to talk to a couple of us on one-on-ones at various points, and a friend of mine called up who was running things and said, Anne, everybody's canceled, blah, 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 blah. Would you mind meeting with her right now instead of, with everybody else tomorrow? And I was like, okay. So I walk over to this cafe where I'm supposed to meet with her. And then somebody comes out who was the one who was supposed to meet with her before and says, you know what? She's really sick right now. I said, oh, okay. So she's asking if you'd come up to her hotel room to have your meeting. So I said, okay. So then we have this amazing scene in a teeny tiny Paris hotel room with poor Rosemary Brosnan in the bed, looking very, very green, and me perched in the little chair. And I handed her the opening chapters of A Cabinet of Earth, and she was reading them and laughing. And I thought, oh, okay. I would try to notice where she was laughing. And then she said, I don't usually say this, but when you're done, send this to me. And so that was really the beginning. Actually, she got sicker and ended up in the hospital the next day. So if I hadn't met her then, I would not have at all. But she was wonderful, and eventually that's the book that became my first published children's book, 2012. So some years after our hotel room encounter.
How many years later was that?
I guess that was in 2008, so 4 years later.
That must have been quite the amazing experience that she comes out of the hospital. She's like, whew, I'm so glad that that's over and I've survived, because now I need to reach out to Anne Nesbit and I have to get this book.
Yeah, I don't know if the timeline was exactly like that, but certainly I felt incredibly fortunate. And I've been incredibly lucky in all of my editors, I have to say. I think editors are the most amazing people on earth. They read things with such love and precision, and it's just an incredible thing. When I talk to students, I often show pictures of an editorial letter that I've gotten, and actually any of my editorial letters would do, because they've all been like 13, 14 pages long, single spaced, and then they'll start with, "Oh, Anne, this is so wonderful. This is going to be so great." And, that lasts for, 2 sentences. And then you get 12 pages of everything that's wrong, and all the holes and all the gaps. And the students are always groaning, right, when I show them my 13-page editorial letters. And then I say, no, it's this incredible gift of love. If somebody is paying that close attention to something that you're making, it's an incredible gift. So I actually really appreciate editors and teachers. Anybody who gives revision advice is a hero in my book. Anybody who reads things closely.
And I assume that usually you don't have to sit there nervously while they read your book.
No, that was a one-off.
That might be one of the most terrifying things I've ever heard. I'm okay with a 13, 14-page editorial letter, but sitting there and watching an editor go through your manuscript, you must have nerves.
I know. Somebody who is experiencing nausea at that moment. Right. Yeah. That is very nerve-wracking. It's true.
And is your editor usually the first person to see your manuscript, or who gives you notes and revision prior to an editor?
Oh, that's a good question. It really varies. So right now, I'm working with Kalyn Adair. She was the editor for all 3 of my Candlewick books, including Daring Darleen, and she is incredible. What can I say? There was this period towards the end of revising Daring Darleen where she was like reading things and I was trying to fix them, and things were going back and forth across the continent, and this was happening in real time, which is of course rare in the editing situation, because generally speaking, what happens is you get your 13 pages of comments, and then you spend ages wrestling with them to make it work out, and then you send, hopefully, your revised version, you hope that it's better, off to the editor, and then, ages later, she has time to look at it and so on. But there was one particular phase with Daring Darleen where we were under the gun and, had to get this absolutely sealed up in a few days, and that was really, I think, the most fun I've ever had in my entire life. But I mean, so who sees it first? I mean, sometimes my agent, Amy Joan Paquette, will be looking at things and give advice too. There's another person who has a really keen eye for sort of seeing the heart of something and what you're trying to do. So it sort of depends where we are in the process, who sees something first.
So curious, you say it's the most fun you've ever had. What was it that made that experience so enjoyable?
Well, I think it's that, one of the things that's wonderful about writing is feeling a universe fall into place, right? So all these little bits come together. It's really this incredible anti-entropic miracle. When the jigsaw puzzle is beginning, at first it's really hard. You're putting things in, you're trying to figure out where things go, and then at some point you are kind of putting in the pieces faster, and you feel like, oh yeah, this is how it was supposed to be. I don't know exactly what gives us that feeling of something being already preformed that you're just discovering, but I think a lot of people who write or probably do all sorts of different kinds of artistic things have that sense at some point. You get it and you go, oh, okay, it's sort of like this. It's deceptive because, of course, you're never right. Like you're never you're caught into this wave of thinking that you're being kind of led towards this wonderful thing. But when you get there, you realize you're actually just at the next starting line for making it better. But okay, but that moment of being caught up in something and just being absorbed in this other world and figuring out how everything is going to go and how the sentences are going to look and what words you're going to use and what should happen there and why did she do that, all of that I find just incredibly thrilling. I always say I'm never really happy unless I'm living in more than one world at a time. So I have to be in at least 2 different worlds to be happy. And reading was how I did that when I was a kid. That would let me live in more world than one. And then at some point I realized as a child that you could read, you could write something, and it felt like reading. So you would write a story for yourself, and it would feel like you were reading that story. And I think that's when I became hooked.
Of course, you're reading the story that happens to go exactly the way you would most like for it to go. Sometimes.
Yeah, it doesn't quite feel that way, though, right? Because there's so much uncertainty and so much, you just, I don't know. It feels a little more high wire than being a closed circle where you're like, oh, I'll just make up the story I want to hear. I think it's, often people talk about whether people are plotters or pantsers, whether they plot things out carefully ahead of time or do everything by the seat of their pants or something. And I've always felt it's both. I plot a lot. Every book starts with a notebook, and there's just, this notebook took a long time. You can see it's kind of worn out. That was my Daring Darleen notebook. So I plot, and then I write a draft. But even while I'm writing that draft, it turns out that plotting is a bit of an illusion, because you're still really out there trying to fly over the abyss. You have to make up things as you go. It's never quite as certain as, oh, I've set everything out, and so now it's just automatic. So I think that's what also makes this sense of reading and writing close for me, that when I'm reading, I don't know where the story's going to go. When I'm writing, I thought I knew where the story was going to go, but I didn't actually. And so there's this sense of just reading very slowly.
So how much time are you spending with the notebook plotting before you actually start your draft? The notebooks always, they carry on. So I will keep writing in the notebook as I go. So I do a lot of plotting in the notebook, and I start writing, and then I have to come back and replot and think and do bits of research and all the rest, and then I'm writing again, and then I'll be sending off a draft and getting it back, and with the 13-page previously described editorial letter, and the letter will say, this is fine, it just needs a plot and a character that we care about and stakes or something like this, in other words. Sure, just those little
things. And so then, you go back, you weep, and you go back to the notebook, and you start figuring out how to solve those problems. So I guess the notebook is it starts before I start drafting, but then it's a constant companion through, and it really varies how long I'm just in notebook phase before I start drafting. Part of that depends on where we are in the teaching year.
So how long on average, does it take you to get from the start of that notebook to approaching a finished draft? Because I know, obviously, publishing gets involved. You can't necessarily control the timeline past a certain point. But by the time you're turning in a draft that's ready for that 13-page letter, what's our time?
Right. Yeah, well, I look back at this notebook just to see when I started, and I started in September of 2017, plotting out Daring Darleen, and so here it is, spring of 2020, and we had some, delays that weren't anybody's fault and so on. So that's actually in my writing history, that's pretty speedy, actually. I think once I'm at the point where I'm just drafting, I can draft, once I've got a first draft, I think I have it plotted out. I'm always wrong, but I think that I know how it's supposed to go, and etc. Okay, then usually I can do a draft of that in the first draft in like 6 weeks or something. But that's the first draft. And then that's not one that I'm yet sending off to people for 13-page letters. And then there's, the reworking, the going back to this, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's only when it's been through a lot of iterations does it go off to one of the people who, whose opinion really matters.
And are you going straight to your literary agent first, or who gets first crack at it?
Actually, that depends on whether the book is under contract or not. So
makes sense.
Yeah. So with Cloud and Wallfish, for instance, my agent saw it first, and then it went to Kalyn Adair, and then but then Candlewick had bought that plus another book. And that book, the second one, was only like one sentence mentioned on a phone call when at the time it was contracted. So there, I was starting sort of from scratch and so on. And so that draft went to Kalyn earlier than it would otherwise have gone.
And now that you've been working with the same editor, you said for 3 books now?
Yeah.
At this point, is your relation, do you have kind of a comfortable shorthand between you? Has that sped the process up a little bit?
Oh, I think so. I think, part of working with anybody is sort of figuring out the methods that work best for interacting. And so, like even little things like how is editing most effective? Like what kinds of comments are most effective and so on. Some of this doesn't happen consciously necessarily, but you sort of work that out together. And also, whenever you work with wonderful editors, and I've been so lucky, as I said, to have worked with a few of them, you internalize a lot of their lessons. And so you're thinking as you're writing and as you're redrafting, you're already thinking, oh, what would Rosemary or Kalyn, what would they say about this? What would they want here? And so you're in a way already anticipating the things that they would say in a 13-page letter, which just doesn't mean that you don't get a 13-page letter full of complaints, but it means maybe the complaints are slightly higher level than they would have.
Book 4 or 5, maybe you'll get it down to 11 pages. Who knows?
Oh, that happy day. I don't know.
And it seems like it would be almost unfair for Kayla to have to work with another author. She's got you pretty well trained. You know what to do.
I guess she's got a bunch of us pretty well trained at this point. Yeah.
And I know, obviously, and I should mention, what is today? Today is April 28th. Anytime I mention that we are in quarantine, I feel, because the news moves so fast, I feel compelled to explicitly state that we are recording this April 28th, we don't know about all the things that have come along in the news since you and I talked. Earlier today, the Pentagon confirmed the release of a video of flying saucers, and it barely made headlines because we've got bigger issues right now. So that is where we're at this time. But prior to quarantine, what did your usual writing schedule look like for the week?
Yes. Well, since I'm a full-time teacher, it looked like those chunks of time that I could carve out of my teaching and grading and preparing schedule. So it really varies, and it depends on where I am in a particular project. Like once something gets underway, if I'm in the middle of drafting or if I'm in the middle of revising, then of course it has a kind of energy and momentum of its own, and so I have to, I just have to do that every day. But sometimes the teaching, which is it keeps you very busy. Sometimes that has to be sort of the dominant thing, and then I'm stealing my moments to keep going. But as I said, I have to always be living in more worlds than one, and so if I do not write, I become miserable. It's a gradual decline, but I do become miserable.
Well, you set goals for yourself on a daily basis, like a word count, or is it really just kind of?
Well, it depends. Again, it depends on where I am. What it is that I have to do. If I'm drafting something, I like to do first drafts on Scrivener because you get the lovely progress bar that goes from red to green. And I'm just like Pavlov's dog. I love seeing it go from red to green, and I'm very motivated to get it to go from red to green every day, and so on and so forth. So yes. So for something like that, yes. Then I have a goal, and I'm pretty regularly meeting that goal, and so on and so forth. If I'm in a different period, if I'm doing research and plotting, then of course it's still a thrilling process. I really enjoy it, but how you measure how much you've accomplished is more nebulous, because you can get swept up in considering some small aspect of something that may not even actually survive the editing process of the book, but feels very important at the time as you're tracking it down and reading all the newspapers from 1914, et cetera.
And so on a day when you've got a full class load, you've got to be mostly focused on that. How much are you able to sneak in?
So again, it depends on what I'm trying to do, what I'm trying to sneak in, where I am in the process. If I'm in the drafting or the thrilling revising process, I will sneak in the day's quota of whatever I have to do, no matter what. But of course it's hard. It's really hard during the semester, and as the semester goes on, it gets harder, because once you're grading papers, everything slows down. Grading is incredibly hard.
What I'm hoping for is a little sound bit I can play for my fiction workshop students who send me emails that I was just too busy today, I couldn't get to it. And I want to say no, and Nesbit had a full class load, and she still managed to do blank.
Well, yeah, that's right. I mean, sometimes I do, but as I said, it has its own reward, because it makes life worth living. It keeps me happy. It's incredibly rewarding in its own right. So yeah, so it doesn't feel, that's not the part of writing that feels like a slog in those phases. The parts that are hard are when you feel stuck somewhere, or you become sort of super critical of everything you do, or you kind of lose, or you start thinking. Actually, I guess part of it is whenever you're thinking more about the business of writing, that saps a certain kind of energy from you, and it becomes depressing. But when you're thinking about the creative thing itself that you're working on, the world that you're building and all of that, then that gives you energy. And so that's not something I'm not ever blocked about that. I just, sometimes sometimes you just feel like, oh, you feel hopeless, or, will I ever have another good idea? Or, will I ever have time? And actually, of course, you're never going to have time, really. But if you have something that you're in the middle of, if you can get into the middle of something, then it makes its own time for you.
Makes sense. I love that idea of will I ever have another good idea? Because what if someone could definitively say to you, no, you've had all the good ideas. What do you do then? You're going to keep trying.
Right. And we've all had so many ideas that we've never done anything with. So I suppose if some evil magic goblin came and said to me, you'll never have another new idea again, I would immediately be parsing that in my favor by saying, okay, what are the loopholes here? I guess the loopholes have to be, I still get to work with the ideas that I had, all through the rest of my life. And so those aren't new. And after all, really nothing's new under the sun. So if I come up with something, but someone else had that idea in the 16th century, I guess I'm good with that too, right, Goblin? So, yeah, I guess we can't be overly dependent on inspiration, on trusting in inspiration.
I tell you, at that point, you should immediately sit down and write a novel about the evil goblin. Oh my God, tell the world.
Right, the depressing, the anti-writing goblin, right? Telling you all these absolutely horrible things. That's true, I could do that.
And you mentioned that you said, I think, 3 books before you had the 4th one that you were able to take to the sick editor in Paris and get that sold.
Yeah.
So what happened with those? Are those on a shelf someplace? Have you cannibalized them for other stories?
Well, two of them were these science fiction novels, and I will always be very fond of them, and I have friends who love them. So that's good. I think so. They have their little small set of readers. That's probably what they'll have. I think I will end up doing science fiction at some point again. And then the third one, I think I might return to that, actually. I really love that book. And I never did anything with it. I never really showed it to people or anything.
So there is at least one more Ann Nesbit book out there just waiting to be discovered. Be excited, world. It's coming.
No, I hope there are more than that, but most of them would be kids' books. This one for grown-ups that I would like to go back and polish up sometime.
So now we've covered, and we're going to pivot to Daring Darleen, because I'm always watching our time, and I know editors, publicists, agents are listening and they say, oh my God, talk about the book. Not to worry, we will talk about the book, but we've covered your routine in normal times. So for all of those authors listening who are struggling to find a way to get on with some sort of normality here in quarantine, what has your quarantine experience been like thus far? How are you finding time to write?
Yes, I think this being in quarantine is really hard. I mean, it's especially hard for people with young children. They're absolutely, I'm in awe of all the people with young kids. But for everybody, I think the hard thing is being in the middle of this difficult situation and not knowing how the story ends. We don't know what happens next. We don't know where we're going to be in a week or a month or 2 months. And I think just fretting about that means that your brain some percentage of your brain is really busy telling yourself stories that are about the current catastrophe and where it might be going and so on, right? And that takes a lot of energy and a lot of creative energy and a lot of brain energy. We'd all be better off if we didn't do it, probably, if we could just like, whoop, you know, I'm in my house. I don't know why. But that's hard to achieve. So I think a certain amount of kindness for ourselves as writers. I know as a teacher, everything is harder doing it online. And as a writer, even though maybe the basic aspects of writing are the same. You've got the computer, you're finding a little corner to hide in, and then you're typing away. That's not changed that much. But we have to have compassion for ourselves because of that 40% of our brain that's busy worrying and making up unhelpful stories about the future. So yeah, I would say when things are hard, writing gets harder with everything else. On the other hand, the effect of actually doing something creative is enhanced. I mean, doing something creative as medicine. I think it's really the best medicine out there. The world is sort of falling apart, so it feels. But if you are putting a story together or making something beautiful or making something work, that is incredibly healing. Again, it has that feeling of sort of shaking your fist at entropy and saying, okay, everything's falling apart out there, but this little bit of life, you know, I can still make a world.
I have found myself being just a little bit crueler to my characters than I normally am, because I need them to have really bad problems to completely distract me from the actual problems that are going on.
Well, yeah. I went through this period where it seemed like every time I wrote about a mother in a book, something terrible would happen to her, and then that would happen in real life. And my kids were like, "Mom, you gotta be a little bit kinder to the mothers." So I promised that only nice things would happen to mothers in my stories from then on. This was not true, however. Not exactly true. So I don't know. I mean, maybe being extra cruel makes sense. Actually, I can see that. Also, wanting not to be as cruel as usual, you know, like wanting some nice things to happen, also makes sense under the circumstances. Like, I can see why a person might want to be reading books that have happy endings right now. I can also see why you might want to read books in which, you know, the zombies do take over and tear everything apart. So, yeah, both. As I said, I'm really, I don't know if I said it, but I was thinking it. I'm really omnivorous in what I read. So, and that spills over into the writing. So I can see it both ways, being darker and lighter at this time.
If you read about zombies, then you could be a little bit grateful that thus far, again, April 28th, when we're recording this. So if the zombie apocalypse starts May 1st, we don't know about it yet. But thus far, no zombies. So look, something to be a little bit grateful for.
Well, I've honestly never quite understood the science of zombies. So I would want to read more studies about how that all works, because it does seem to me that it's hard for me to understand how you can be so overrun by creatures that literally falling apart as they decay. But maybe I've misunderstood something about decay, or zombie force or something like that.
There's so many different versions of the zombie apocalypse to try and grab any one of them. My favorite type of zombie story usually is one that avoids the origins of the zombies, because there's no origin you're going to tell me that convinces me the zombies are real. Just get to the part where they chase our heroes.
Well, I was just actually teaching Justine Ireland's Dread Nation, and there she has the zombies. They rise up during a battle in the Civil War, and the metaphorical side of that makes so much sense that who cares about the science, really?
That's true. Okay, well here's our official pivot then. So, what is it like launching a book now in the time of quarantine?
Well, it's really it's it's very sad. The thing is, as a writer, you produce a book with all the people who are working to make it beautiful and to do things like I don't know if you can see it, but there's a film strip on the back spine of this book. Little details like that, they're amazing. Okay, so all this effort goes into making this amazing thing. And you let go of it maturely, as one must, because as soon as it's out there, it's out of your hands. But you let go of it only the same way that you let go of your children when they go off to college or out in the world, which is to say that you still hope very much that they do okay, they find their way and all the rest. And so I always feel this great sense of responsibility for the poor book. I want the poor book to be okay. And of course, to emerge into the world at a time when when all the bookstores are closed and the libraries are closed, and of course the libraries are open online and doing amazing things there. And many of the little independent bookstores I love are online and selling things online. But of course, that's not the same thing as people being able to go into a space and browse and pick it up and look and see and decide whether they like it or not. So it is one of those, I don't think there's a bright side to coming out during the apocalypse. But what can you do? I mean, these things happen. I had something like 9 events set up. I'm an introvert, so I'm shy. So it was scary for me to reach out and set things up. And I was very proud of the way I had done it, but they all went poof. So what things have you found other than appearing on this amazing podcast? Obviously, all you need really. But other than that, what things have you found to do to promote the book? So people started saying, "Oh, Anne, could you make a little video?" So I made a little video about the historical research that went into Daring Darleen, and I made a book trailer that I really am proud of because it has a sort of old-timey feel to it. It looks sort of like a silent movie, but has little splashes of color in it. And then I'm going to be a participant in the Everywhere Book Fest in my future, your future, but the past for whoever's watching us on the podcast. That's May 1st, May 2nd, so the end of what is the current week for us. And that'll be fun. I'm on a panel with Sayantani Dasgupta and Jay Anderson Coates, and we're talking about science versus magic in our books, and we have a duel going on, so that was fun. But that, of course, takes so much more work than doing something live. I mean, because as you know very well, the thing about doing things that you record is that you have to kind of know what you're doing. Then there's always a lot of editing that comes into it, and it's not easy. And even though I teach film, I'm not a filmmaker, so I teach film history. So editing and all that, I have an idea. I have sort of a high bar that I couldn't possibly reach, and that I kind of know what it should look like if it were good. But actually doing it myself turns out to be a real skill set that I don't have. So it takes an enormous amount of work for me to produce something that looks like it was made by, squirrels with twigs or something. So there are things going online. And I think, another thing that I was going to be doing was the Bay Area Book Fest. And I think that they're going to be putting some things online as well. And there are other events that, again, are saying, "Oh, we'll do something online." But it's not the same as being in rooms with people who love reading. And actually, I'm just sorry also that I didn't get to do my traditional BookSync book launch party. I always think of a good cookie to bake. That's again, that's not my skill set either. So I'm not saying that these cookies are absolutely delicious, but they are traditional. And I always try to find a theme that would go with whatever the book was. And so this time I was like, got it. This one is super easy. I can just do rectangular cookies and they will look like frames of a film. I'll put the little sprocket holes in frosting on the side. And then I can do my favorite frame. Again, you will not probably be able to see it. Can you see it with the 3 exclamation points?
Sure. Uh-huh.
Yeah. I was like, okay, I can do that. Even I can frost 3 exclamation points. And there you go. So that was that. I was looking forward to that. But those cookies have
cookies and now you won't have to share them. So bonus.
So now I can't even find flour, so I can't make the cookies. But I'm hoping that at some point I'll have like a belated, just as my kids who are graduating from college with no graduation ceremony are hoping that they'll get to do one later. I'm hoping that I'll be able to do a kind of after the fact, book launch, time machine book launch, whenever we emerge from our houses again and dance in the streets.
Yeah, no, we'll have a solid week of never coming home, just out.
Except I don't think it's going to work that way. Like, at least the messages I'm getting from time machines suggest it's not going to be quite. There isn't going to be one moment where we say, "Hooray, hooray, hooray, we're out." So we'll see. But maybe in a year, I could have a kind of a year later book party.
No, I'm struggling desperately to try to put some optimistic spin on a situation for which there really isn't one. But the alternative is just to sink down and go, "Oh Lord, take me now." That's not helpful.
Well, reading is still important. Stories are still important. Books are still important. And this particular apocalypse is not going to last forever. So, in a couple years, people will be back to bookstores, and before that, I certainly hope. But this is not forever. This is just a hard period. But the books that I write often are about. They're set in times that are difficult, that are hard. In Cloud and Wallfish, which is the one set in East Germany in 1989, the main character realizes that he's living in history, and that's actually not that much fun when you find yourself living in history. It's often pretty hard. And so I would say to kids when I visit schools, we're all living in history right now. And I was saying that even before the virus hit.
Oh, sure.
Last 3
years, we've all been living in an incredible period of American history.
Yes, we are. It's busy.
Assuming there is a presidency after this, and I'm no longer convinced that's such a swell idea, because if this can happen again, maybe we need to find a new system. But assuming that we can say, well, yeah, no, I was there for the worst that the presidency had to offer. I remember living through that. There's my optimistic spin. All of us authors will be able to write much more authentically about our characters living through hard times. That's the spit shine I've got for it.
I think so. It probably changes the way that we read books and think about things. I know it changes it for me. I keep reading these books and I'm like, oh gosh, they're playing together, they're going places together, or did they just hug each other in that book, and things like this, because suddenly you're aware of social distancing rules, even for fictional characters living in a time that is not this one.
Don't shake hands, you'll all die. Oh no.
Yeah, don't shake hands. Don't touch things. As my kids said about our dog, poor thing, she doesn't realize she's a surface because she keeps wanting to go up and say hello to people. And, she's a surface. So we haul her back.
Well, let us turn our attention to 1914. By golly, I've got some questions for you about this wonderful book. So we'll talk about the past when there's no social distancing, there's no COVID-19. By God, they didn't know how good they had it. So
well, they had other difficulties on the way.
Oh, absolutely. As this book illustrates many. So I promise not to summarize your book and spoil it and do a terrible job. I would never do that to you. If you would, please tell esteemed audience a little bit about Daring Darleen.
So Daring Darleen is about a girl named Darleen who has just grown out of her first career, which was as a star, as a sort of child star in silent films where she would be made adorable. And then she was Darling Darleen. And now she's outgrown that L, and she's become Daring Darleen, and she's the heroine in adventure serials, which are actually an incredibly popular fad in the teens. So it was this amazing moment where film was becoming a big business, and it was learning how to keep people strung along in a story. And they wanted to get people to come back to the theaters again and again, week after week to see the films. And so they thought, oh, we'll serialize things. So we'll have adventures that stretch out over many, many short films. Sometimes those adventures would be complete in one episode, and then you'd wait and you'd get another episode that sort of told a different story. And often they would have cliffhangers at the end, so that you would come back for the next episode. And these were incredibly popular in the teens. So you had things like The Perils of Pauline and The Hazards of Helen. So my character, Darleen, is in The Dangers of Darleen, and it's being filmed in Fort Lee, New Jersey, which was sort of, you could call it the Hollywood of its day. Hollywood already existed a little bit in 1914, but it was not yet absolutely completely dominant. It would become so pretty soon after this book, actually because of World War I, which is going to start after the end of this story. But then it became even more pressing to get to the warm Californian shores where there was light all year round, and you didn't have to use a lot of coal to heat your studios. So New Jersey did not look anywhere as good once coal became a shortage during the war. Anyway, so her family is at a studio in Fort Lee called Matchless Studios, which is a name I'm incredibly proud of having thought up. There were lots and lots of different movie studios in Fort Lee, and one of them did have the name Peerless, and so I'm kind of riffing on that for Matchless, but then there's a pun because the thing about movie studios is that just like the Scarecrow, the one thing they really were worried about was a lighted match. They were incredibly flammable places. They had chemicals going, and celluloid film was incredibly flammable, and the whole thing was very dangerous. And every now and then, these studios would burn down. So my studio is called Matchless. And she's making these adventure serials, and her extended family that's busy working at the studio decides that what they want to do to get people to come and see the films is they're going to stage a fake kidnapping of Darleen at the opening of a big theater, the Strand Theater in New York City, in April 1914. Historical, really happened, the opening of the theater part. So completely plausible. Anyway, and of course, the fake kidnapping goes awry and turns into a real kidnapping, and she ends up being really kidnapped with an heiress named Victorine. And even though they have just completely different backgrounds and so on, the two girls have to work together and do all sorts of actual sort of stunts and so on to get themselves out of the clutches of the kidnappers and get back to the movie studios and be making the next episode of the adventure serial while continuing to avoid and eventually trap kidnappers. So that's the story. It's basically meant to be a little bit of an echo of the old adventure serials. I try to have cliffhanger endings of the chapters. You know, it wants to keep going at a certain clip. They get to do all sorts of adventures on the screen and off, all sorts of stunts. I'm really interested in silent film tricks. I teach film history. I teach the early part of film history. And one of the things I love most is seeing students amazed by the kinds of special effects that silent film could produce, even though they did not have post-production, they did not have computers, and in the early days, all of those special effects had to be done in the camera. So you had to be doing those special effects somehow while you were running your camera, making the film. And that's incredibly hard to do. So in that class, we do a lot of looking at things, and then I'll say, okay, how'd they do that, right? How'd they do that? And we'll try to figure out how they did that. And so there's a lot of that comes up in Daring Darleen, because those film tricks are just so much fun. I couldn't resist it.
Wasn't the answer sometimes the special effect was just a reckless endangerment and disregard for human life?
Right. That is a good point. So, yeah, one of the things about these, the adventure serials that were so popular in the teens was that they tended to star young women. And the young women were asked to do all sorts of incredibly dangerous things, like leaping leaping onto trains, off of bridges, riding motorcycles, off bridges into the river, flying away in hot air balloons. I mean, all sorts of incredibly dangerous things. And part of the marketing for the adventure serials was convincing the public that these were real. Sometimes they were actually pretty real. I mean, certainly they were being asked to do some tricks that were riskier than anything that we would ask people to do now. But of course, movie magic also had its role to play, and editing was used to make some of these tricks look more convincing. But I was really fascinated by these early film stars like Pearl White and Helen Holmes, who are starring in these adventure serials. So that they were part of the model for Daring Darleen. She's a few years younger than they are, but okay, that's plausible. The other parent for her, sort of fictional parent or real parent, I don't know whether I'm real or fictional at this point, but is a child star from the silent period whom I met, named Baby Peggy. That was what her working name was as a small child. She actually lived until this February. So she lived to the age of 101. And she came to this silent film festival that I go to every year, the largest silent film festival in the world. Happens every year in Italy. So who knows whether it will happen this year. But she came, and we watched her films from when she was a very small child, acting in all sorts of different kinds of films, and she would talk about what it was like being a child star during the silent period. And it was so inspiring because you could see how brilliant she was. I mean, she had been brilliant as a child. What they were asking kids to do in these films, again, just as they were asking a lot from the adventure serial heroines, they were asking a lot from the kids acting in the films. They had to be able to do all sorts of things, act incredibly well, follow instructions really well. It's amazing what they could do. So she was also a kind of inspiration, although she was a child star a few years later than my Darleen, because it was the early 20s when she was in her heyday as a child star. But But anyway, yeah, it's sort of that combination of the adventure heroine and the silent film child star that I wanted to roll together into one for my Darleen.
Well, I'm glad that modern film does not put actors in the same amount of danger. On the other hand, I get tired of movies where when the action starts, the characters become, like the old Max Fleischer Superman cartoon. They become animated, and I'm very aware that I'm watching a high-tech video game.
Yeah, there is something incredibly, I think, touching about the earlier practical film tricks. I'm just a total sucker for those. I love it. Whenever things are done, when you can see the tape and glue holding things together. You can kind of figure out how they did something physically in order to make that object look like it disappeared or exploded or whatever. I love all of those things. I love seeing in early stop motion animation. I love those moments when you get the ghost shadow of the animator's hand as they're moving the teddy bears around and so on and so forth. I love all of that, and I kind of miss that in the new films where the special effects are amazing, and what's accomplished now is just incredible. No, of course, it's amazing. It's incredible. It takes a huge amount of work too, so it's not like people are not working as much as they used to. They are, but I miss the flawed nature of it. The sort of handmade quality that you can see in special effects in the past.
Trying to remember what the film was. It was was one of the special editions for Jurassic Park. They had an early film with stop motion dinosaurs. Might have been King Kong, but they were reading the reviews from both that original film plus the reviews for the new Jurassic Park and then Jurassic World, and they were almost identical with amazement. So it was just, who were you in the audience if you'd never seen anything like that? That was the most amazing thing you would have ever seen at that time.
Right. I hope that our appetite for amazement has remained broad so that we can also be amazed by things that use older techniques and amazed by old film. I do think it's still amazing. I love silent film, and I think it's still very much worth watching. And also, I love, I love stop motion animation now, like Coraline or something. It's just incredible what people were able to do there. So people, it's not all computers, even though, again, computer work also completely legitimate, takes an immense amount of creativity and effort and all the rest, and creates incredible things. So I guess I'm up for film of all sorts, using all sorts of techniques. I just wouldn't want us to throw all of the old stuff overboard.
So you obviously, between teaching and attending festivals, you clearly have this huge passion in your life for silent films. So when you sit down to work specifically on Daring Darleen, how much research do you still have to do, and how do you go about it?
Yeah, well, my film historian background was especially focused on Russian and Soviet film. So the history of early Russian film and Soviet film is quite different from what was going on in New York and New Jersey in the teens. However, as I said, I went to these silent film festivals every year and would watch literally hundreds of silent films every year brought from archives around the world, including a large number of films filmed in Fort Lee, New Jersey. So I had at least a kind of passive knowledge of what was going on in the United States and in Fort Lee. And then I learned more when I was teaching the history of film, when I started teaching History of Film Part 1. And it was, in fact, as I was teaching the serial adventure films week for that, when I thought, actually, this could be a good kids book. I should do that. I've done some of the research already. How about that? And then I really dug into it. So I love doing research. I mean, that's the thing that ties my writing and my academic career together. I love digging into things and going down rabbit holes and looking at primary sources. I just love it. So I started reading a lot about Fort Lee, New Jersey, about early American film history. One of the characters in the book is a real live, well, no, she's no longer alive, but she was at the time alive. That's Alice Guy Blaché, who was one of the first filmmakers in the world. She worked for Gaumont in the starting in the 1890s. So right at the beginning of film history, she was making films of all kinds for the French filmmaker. And then eventually she came to the United States with her husband, who had also a Gaumont employee, and their job was to try to sell America on sound film, actually, because she had been doing a lot of experiment with sound film very early. In fact, it turned out to be too early, and nobody could believe that that was what we really needed in films. And so that project didn't happen in the United States. But she started this film studio, Solax, in Fort Lee, and it was incredibly successful. And she was, one of the most influential women in filmmaking for a period there. So I have my fictional characters get tangled up with the real live but fictionalized Madame Blaché. So I, of course, read all sorts of biographies of Alice Guy Blaché and watched her films and read her autobiography, read things about her. I paid extra good attention when I was at film festivals for films set in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and people may have been irritated by me cheering when a film came on that was made in 1914, set in Fort Lee, and was about I think it was a trolley driver. And I was like, oh my gosh, look at that. That's my trolley. That's my trolley. Okay. So, yeah, so I did lots of research like that. I also read through all sorts of movie magazines from the time. So fan magazines, they were incredibly popular. They had huge numbers of people subscribing to them. So I read movie star gossip and gossip about films being made, gossip about Alice Guy Blaché. And then I also focused on newspapers and reading about what was going on day by day on the days that I was describing in my book. So there's a lot in the book that comes right off the front page of the New York Times from, I think it was April 12th, 1914, because the Strand Theater actually opened April 11th, 1914, and was covered in the New York Times the next day, as and in all sorts of other newspapers as well. And there were all sorts of amazing things on the front page of the New York Times on April 12th, 1914. I'm telling you, like the Pope coming down hard on tango. that was under the fold on the front page of the New York Times. And some poor woman who had died of mercurial poisoning under questionable circumstances, and so on and so forth. So some of that I snuck into the book, as well as just getting a feeling for what the weather was on any given day, how people got from Manhattan over to Fort Lee, taking the ferry. What was that like? What did the ferry look like? Were there spittoons on the ferry? Yes, there were. What was everyday life like for people who were extras in the film studios? How did the film studios run? All of that, really infinite numbers of rabbit holes for me to dig into.
So a couple of questions about that. One, and this is something I ask frequently when I talk with history writers, because I find that it's a pretty common trait. I know when I had Avi on, He let me know that he checks the weather of every day he writes about. My question is always, unless I'm looking through those papers also, I'm not going to be able to call your bluff if you tell me it was a sunny day and really it was rainy. So is it just so that you would know that that's off, or?
Well, it's a mix of things, part of it. So I think it's actually fine to fictionalize a lot when you're writing about the past. So when I was writing Orphan Band of Springdale, which just came out in paperback, by the way. And
available in fine bookstores everywhere as of this moment.
Anyway, it's set in 1941 in rural Maine, and it's based loosely on my mother's childhood. She was sent to live in an orphanage run by her grandmother when things got hard for her family. And there, my mother died quite young, so I didn't have access to her there was no one left who actually remembered the true truth. So I had to fictionalize the whole thing. I even changed one letter in the name of the town to sort of respect of the differences between my fictional version of things and the real life version of things. And yet I still went through the local paper and read through everything that happened that year and used lots and lots of that in the book. So I think whenever we're writing anything, it's always a mixture of fiction and fact. But I think that digging into what happened in the past deepens your stories, even the fictional sides of them somehow. And you find things that you don't expect. I guess it's sort of like that plotting versus pantsing question again. That if you think you already know everything about some period and you're just going to write the thing that you think you know, and you haven't gotten your hands dirty digging into the primary sources and reading through the local papers and everything, you won't know all the riches and strangenesses that were there waiting to be dug up. Some of them you may not use, but they do just add this three-dimensional feeling to the historical world that you're creating. I think also at silent film festivals, so silent film fans and historians tend to love details. So you can be sure that there are going to be people who are going to find everything I got wrong. Just as, there are people who just know so much about silent film that one of the games they used to play in this big festival is archivists would bring little bits of film that they found in their archive and they have no idea what it is. And they would screen those, and you'd have this audience of 1,000 film historians and film fans and so on there, and people would just shout out, "Oh, that's so-and-so." And they would know who these actors were, what studio it was, or where that outdoor location was. There are people who can recognize every building in Fort Lee, New Jersey, and tell you when it shows up in a film. And they'll go, okay, that was on such and such a street, da-da-da-da-da. So I think part of that kind of infects me as well, from coming out of a film historian background. You want to have, because it's so thrilling. I really think the material that comes out of the worlds of the past is actually fascinating in and of itself. So I love digging it up.
So you've got those people in the back of your mind, like, if I don't get this right, they are going to crucify me when I see them again.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I think, I'm all right. I know I'm all right with it. It's fine. But I think it's more that, in fact, I'm thinking this little tidbit, almost nobody is going to recognize what I'm really talking about here, or the real thing that this is actually a reference to. But some people are going to be saying, "Oh, that's the Strand Theater. Opened April 11th, 1914. One of the most exciting theater openings, of its day. Woo! Can't believe, is she going to get the color scheme right in the theater? Read, 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 read. Oh, she's got the color scheme right. She remembered the little fountains in the front of the screen. Woo! So it's going to make somebody happy.
Are you one of those people when you read historical fiction? Do you look for those types of details? Do they make you happy?
They make me happy. When I find a detail that has some resonance with the world, yes, it does make me happy.
And just in talking to you and the amount of research and work you've done, plus your background, your enthusiasm for film, the version I have, and of course I've got the advanced reader's copy, there's only 345 pages, but I get the sense you could easily have written for 700, 800 pages, maybe 1,000. So out of all those details that you have, how are you distilling them and getting this into a tight narrative? Because it's not a history lesson. Like you say, there's cliffhangers almost every chapter. You're going to move right along. How do you distill that to make sure that you have those nice moments for the history buffs, plus also all the young readers that need to learn the history without making it feel like a history lesson or bogging down your narrative too much to allow for all that?
I guess part of it is that, okay, I don't think of historical detail as medicine or as the thing that you need to learn or so on. I think of it as the hidden jewel, the little treasure that you can dig up. That's what I love that. And I think that kids actually react well to that sort of thing too. If you're giving them details that are like treasures, they're not things they're going to be tested on. It's not about making them learn lessons for the lesson's sake. It's discovering how wonderful it is to dig up treasure in the past, to read about things that really happened and so on. So, but the question of how do you not get overwhelmed by details? Well, of course you do get overwhelmed by details. I mean, that just happens. But then once again, you have the notebook. So you go through your notebook. You have, and there are all sorts of things in here that did not end up in the book. And you can't put everything in the book. So you're just trying to give little like tips of icebergs, like little kind of jewel-like shining in the sun tips of really interesting historical icebergs. And you just hope that some kids are going to dig a little bit further. I remember being that kid reading, this is not a historical book at all, but reading Madeleine L'Engle's A Wind in the Door, which you may recall has all this stuff about the mitochondrion in it. And I remember and the mitochondrion is like a kind of world that you can go into. I remember how thrilled I was when I found out that was a real thing. Now, her depiction of it wasn't real at all. It was completely fantastic and magical. But the fact that had a tie to this whole other story that was like the miracles of biology meant something to me. I just love seeing that kind of tie and link and connection. So I tend to have them in my books.
Out of curiosity, just in hearing your enthusiasm for film, and obviously you wouldn't be teaching it, you wouldn't be going to festivals, you wouldn't be investing your time if this wasn't something that you loved. Have you ever thought of or attempted to write a screenplay or get involved with films, or why is writing for children the preferred medium for you? Not that, obviously, I don't love writing for children. I 100% support the decision, just out of curiosity.
I think I particularly love writing books for kids because, and for this sort of age group of roughly 8 to roughly 14, but, of course, could expand. But I love writing for kids because kids will fall into stories. I mean, the stories are incredibly important to them. When I think of the books that I read as a child, they kind of shape me and make me who I am. And so I think there's something about the way that young people read that is incredibly moving to me. You know, they're creating worlds when they read, and I love the idea of that energy being given to a story that I wrote. You know, sort of a symbiotic relationship between a child's imagination and these words on a page. So I think it really, I love writing books for children. Writing a screenplay, I think, is a completely different skill set, and I've never done it. And I know, because I have friends who write screenplays and teach screenwriting and so on. I mean, that is something you really have to know what you're about if you're doing that. It takes a lot of work to learn how to do that well. I appreciate the products of screenwriting. I mean, I love a well-written film, but that's not something that I've done.
Well, you say that as opposed to the very easy, not in any way difficult writing a novel for children.
No, writing novels for children is incredibly hard, but I've been doing it for ages and ages, you know. So I think, what is it, the 10,000 hour thing? So I've put my 10,000 hours in. So I've learned something, I hope.
Well, I always want to end while we're still having a good time. So we don't want to drag on too long. I've got about 3 more questions for you. Is that about fair? And we'll call it a night. So the first question sounds kind of lazy, and it is. But I've always tried to do this show, and what I have in mind is, if I were going to be on a podcast talking about my book, how would I want to be interviewed? And something I would want, and I always want to extend this, is what's a question you maybe haven't been asked about during Darleen? What is something that you want esteemed audience to know about this book that maybe we haven't fleshed out in our conversation yet?
Well, I think ideally it would be a question that was like a little detail from the book that I hadn't, you know, that I didn't necessarily know was coming, but since all the little details are in some ways tips of icebergs, probably there's something to say. So for instance, you know, I could take the book and I could like open it randomly. Let's see what happens here. This might not be good. Boom. Okay. Oh yeah. So that was truly random. So I got to page 156, and they're looking at the I Can list, which is the Studio Questionnaire for actors applying to be extras at the studios. And there's all this list that says, which of the following abilities do you possess? Please check. I can ride a horse. I can swim. I can box. I can dance. I can drive a motor car. I can climb ropes. I can stand on my hands. I can wrestle. I can walk on a tightrope. I can play a musical instrument, space, to describe what instrument that is. I can dive from cliffs into a wild churning river. And so I guess you know, like a little detail like that, and someone could say, okay, so why is that there? Did they really have lists like that? And they can say, yes, actually they did. So I changed around some of the items on the list, but that kind of list of general talents, you know, can you swim? Can you box? Can you dance? Can you fence? Can you ride a horse? Was something that actually they did have for extras and people who wanted to work for a movie studio in the teams. Well, so I have it here because I have someone who's going to hide in plain sight by becoming an extra in a film.
I was going to say, one of the questions on there should be, have you filled out your last will and testament? If not, let's make sure we get that done before the camera starts rolling.
Right, exactly.
Lord knows what's going to happen.
After you dive into the churning river. And there are a lot of testimonials from those days about how hard it was to be an actor. I mean, not only were you asked to do all sorts of difficult things, but the pay was terrible. And often you had to supply your own costumes, as well as, you know, paying for your ferry to get across the river from New York, where you probably lived, to Fort Lee, where the studio was, and so on. So it wasn't a huge money-making enterprise for most of the people in it.
Unfortunately, that's completely different now. Moving on.
Right. Same.
And Nesbit, have you ever seen a flying saucer, and do you believe in them?
So I have not personally seen a flying saucer. Every time I have looked up while backpacking and seen something that I thought must be a supernova, it has turned out to be a plane. So, and as far as believing in them, I don't know what I would be being asked to believe exactly. I do think that there must be intelligent life in the universe. I really doubt that it's hanging around here yet. But somewhere out there is or has been some, way, some creature living in a completely different way than we can even imagine. I mean, I think that's the one thing about life in this universe. You keep being shown that everything is just infinitely more surprising and strange than you could possibly have dreamed up.
Excellent answer. And then my last question for you is always some variation of, for all the authors listening, if there was one or two bits of information you could go back and give yourself at the start of your writing career that would have made things easier for you or better for you, in the hopes of making things easier or better for esteemed audience, what would you go back and tell yourself?
I would try to send a hopeful message saying, chin up. You should just start writing. Take it seriously. Go ahead. It's all right to take it seriously. It matters. And start doing that earlier. That would be fine. And don't be thinking that the only serious way to live is by not writing, because you won't be happy that way. And I think it's important to use the gifts and talents that you have, and also to follow your heart in some things. So I think I would try to be encouraging of my younger self, because I think I waited a little bit longer than I needed to give it the kind of attention that I think it deserved. And then the other thing I would say is that to be good, a book does not have to be infinitely long. When I was first starting, I did think that the longer the better, and that was just because that was what I liked. I liked a book that was really long. I figured, if I were going to buy a book at a bookstore, I'd like to have a nice, big, large one so that, it would last for a few days, right? But that turns out not to be the ticket to a successful publishing career.
Sometimes you're just reading a long book, and the pain of reading a bad book is just extended. And where can esteemed audience find you online, stalk you on Twitter, all that good stuff?
So I have a website, Nesbet.com. So my name, even though it sounds easy, is actually spelled strangely, Annenesbet. I joke that nobody has ever spelled it right on the first try. But that is where you will find me. I've got a website, and on Twitter, I'm Ann Nesbet, again, spelled the strange but correct way. So that's, I think, the best places to track me down. And on YouTube, you can search and see my Daring Darleen video for the trailer, which I'm very proud of, even though, again, it's very homespun.
What should esteemed audience search for to find that?
Probably Daring Darleen book trailer would do. Or you could search by my name. That would probably bring it up as well.
And when you find it, make sure you like and subscribe and all that good stuff. And as always, esteemed audience, check out middlegradeninja.com. Find out what's going on with the show, what's going on with me. Download your free copy of Banneker Bones and the Giant Robot Bees. And thank you so much for making the time tonight. This has been an absolute pleasure. I very much enjoyed talking with you, and your enthusiasm has been infectious.
Thank you so much. This was really, really, really fun.
Esteemed audience, God willing and I'm alive, I'll see you next week.